Deputy Connolly is next.
Thanks very much. It's very difficult for all of us here in this environment, and we're here as a Public Accounts Committee. And I just want to go back to the kernel. There's an internal audit carried out, and no assurance that the financial controls of the Garda Síochána are compliant with the public financial procedures. Number 2, no assurance that the financial controls at the Garda College are compliant with the Garda Finance Code. Number 3, limited assurance that the financial controls at the Garda College are compliant. The fourth one is reasonable assurance that the staff costs and so on. There's reasonable assurance. That's why we're here in relation to this. So it's not possible to go into all the minutiae. It's not a court of law. We're a Public Accounts Committee. So I'm looking at that, and I'm looking at various things. Mr. Dunn, just when did you come into the organisation?
In 2013.
13? 13. Until 15?
Yeah, 13.
Until 15?
Yeah, so it was April 2013 to the end of 2015.
Okay. And so we're here then in different rooms, but at the same committee. And we're looking at aspects. And the Commissioner came out, in my view, prematurely to say that there were historical issues. It turns out they're not historical issues. They're ongoing issues. Isn't that right? Would you agree that there are ongoing issues in relation to the Templemore?
Certainly at the point in time. And I believe that there are still issues to be sorted out. But
okay.
at that point in time, so 2015, there were current issues. And there were issues which are recommendations which seem to have been accepted, which haven't been implemented. Okay. So they were current.
Okay. So we have a situation where there are ongoing issues with Templemore, and Chief Superintendent, isn't it? Assistant Commissioner. I know I've read where it was debated whether you should be a director or not a director, and I understand that you're cut. But what I'm trying to get here is there are ongoing issues. So when the Commissioner talks about legacy issues, she jumped the gun. Now, that's for the Commissioner to answer the next day when she's before us. So we're here dealing with issues. A steering group, a committee is set up, and then a steering group to implement the recommendations. And so we should be able to relax. Isn't that right? We should have the problems I've identified. We should be able to relax. Instead of that, we have Mr. Barrett before us, who on the last occasion told us that only for him, I put a specific question to him, there would be no investigation. Would you accept that, Mr. Dunn? Only for Mr. Barrett's persistence, for his note-taking, that there would be, this wouldn't have come out in the manner that it did.
I absolutely accept that if Mr. Barrett hasn't raised it, that it wouldn't have, because it had gone invisible. Okay. But I actually don't agree that it wouldn't have been followed up. That wasn't my experience. And I think, again, if you look at what was going on after Mr. Barrett, so I give him credit for it, right? After Mr. Barrett raised the issue, we engaged with the department. So we, being on Garda Síochána, engaged with the department to make sure that there was visibility there.
After Mr. Barrett raised it?
Absolutely.
Okay.
No, absolutely.
Okay, so you're accepting that as a result of Mr. Barrett, that this whole thing went forward?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Now, Mr. Barrett is of the opinion that he lost faith at some stage. He admits he had a good relationship. I've read the minutes, and you had an open relationship with them, and he loses faith and he starts taking detailed notes.
Yeah.
Isn't that right? So he lost faith somewhere in the system that his concerns were being taken seriously. You'd accept that?
I do, and I think I know why.
Okay, fine.
Because one of the things that became apparent during this process was that Mr. Barrett wasn't aware until, I believe, a number of weeks ago, that the Audit Committee had actually been briefed in September. So what he knew was that he had an expectation it was going to be briefed in July. He knew that didn't happen.
Yes.
But what seems clear to me now is that he didn't realise, I'm not putting this on Mr. Barrett, he hadn't been told that the Audit Committee had been briefed in September and that that there was visibility, and I think he lost trust in me, actually, at that point in time. That's my my sense of it.
I think he had lost trust before that because he was sending letters, I think, in July to you, raising matters in 2015, well before it went to the Audit Committee.
That was, going back to July, I'd actually asked him.
You asked him for a report following, following his initiation, following him coming forward.
Correct. No, absolutely,
okay.
yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. So now, for reassurance for the public, here we are. Yeah. Okay. How did Mr. McGee? Sorry, just you carried out a report in 08, and you've clarified that you've carried that under supervision, and you were reporting back. And subsequently, there's a detailed note in relation to Mr. Dunn and yourself and a conversation. Will I refer to that and help your memory? Or
yes,
can you help me out? Do you remember it?
Yeah, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, now apparently you were sitting minding your own business. Mr. Barrett approaches you and he asks you to talk to you in private.
That's correct.
And you had a conversation with Mr. Barrett.
That's correct.
And you were worried. You were worried, and he reassures you that your job is not at stake, and that he appreciates you coming forward, and he looked on you more as a whistleblower.
I suppose, sorry, to a degree, that's correct. But I wasn't. There wasn't. I didn't have any worries in relation to my position.
You didn't have any. Were you happy with Mr. Barrett when he spoke to you? Were you
Absolutely,
happy?
Yeah.
You were. With his bona fides?
Sorry?
With his bona fides? With Mr. Barrett's bona fides in raising matters? You were happy when he spoke to you that he was doing it?
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so now let me go then to Mr. Dunn. And I hate this, I don't, but this is what's here, you know. And we have 2 documents, Mr. Dunn, from you that have been referred to by one of my colleagues already. And you talked to Mr. Barrett and you talked to Mr. Culhan. And you make a note of the 2 conversations.
Correct, after the letter.
You don't talk to Mr. McGee at all?
No, I didn't.
Oh, yeah. Now, and so you're putting down things that Mr. Culhan has said about Mr. McGee, but you don't talk to Mr. McGee.
No, because there was a letter, if you remember.
I do. That's the background. Yeah. So Mr. Culhan writes to the Commissioner, sends it to a lot of other people.
And to myself.
Yeah. So a lot of people get a copy of that. You then explain that to us. You talk to him.
I spoke to Mr. Culhan, and I actually spoke to Mr. Barrett first.
Yes.
Right, because
I know all that, and I have the note. What I'm asking you is, you didn't talk to Mr. McGee.
No, I didn't.
Okay.
No,
and there was a complete conflict between what Mr. Culhan was saying about Mr. McGee and what Mr. Barrett was saying about Mr. McGee.
And what I did was I asked Mr. Culhan, did he want to... So there would be a formal process to go through.
No,
if there were to be if it were to be taken further, let me just put it that way. And I asked Mr. Culhan, accepted what Mr. Barrett said, I asked Mr. Culhan, was he raising a grievance against Mr. Barrett, in which case a grievance procedure would kick in. He didn't, right?
Just one second now, Mr. Mr. Dunn. The 2nd of November 2015, I told John that I got feedback. Feedback was your kind of code for a serious letter that had gone to the Commissioner.
Correct. I did not tell
So it wasn't
John
feedback, it was a letter.
Yes.
You didn't make Mr. Barrett aware of that very serious letter. You referred to it as feedback.
Correct.
Okay. I told John I got feedback over a meeting that he had had with Barry McGee that I was concerned about. And I wanted to get his observations. I did not say the source or the nature of the feedback.
Correct.
John asked when and so on. I reminded him of our differing views. We've referred to all of that already. He said that there had been a meeting between himself and Barry at Barry's request. Barry had told him he was feeling under pressure over the report he had produced in 2008. Feeling under pressure. John told me he had reassured Barry his job was safe, the issues and so on. John had the file with, and then you wanted cautioning John in relation to his documents and where he might be keeping them in the car or not in the car.
Because there was an assertion in the letter that John had been taking documents.
The secrecy breach. That this has already been out in the open, and the letter was written by Mr. Culhan to say Mr. Barrett perhaps should be examined, or the Commissioner should consider an examination. So that's the background.
Sure.
You go to Mr. Barrett, you don't tell him any of that, you tell him some feedback from an unknown source, and then separately you talk to Michael Culhan. okay, on the 3rd of November, and you report that. And this is a completely different version in relation to Mr. McGee. Yeah. He told me that Barry McGee had come to him concerned at what had transpired with the meeting with John Barrett. Mm-hmm. Okay, he told me that so they were all sitting down having something to eat when John came along and asked Mr. McGee to go to a meeting. And it goes on. Now, what you record here is Mr. Callan's version of that Mr. McGee was under pressure in relation to his meeting with Mr. Barrett, and that in the future, I asked whether Michael wanted to raise a grievance against John, but he said no. He said he was, however, distrustful of he was distrustful of John and would not in the future meet with John on his own. He would be cautious of how he interacted with John and so on. Now here we are in 15. There's a serious crisis in the Garda Síochána. Historical, as the Commissioner says. Sure. Here we have people together, and there's this two different versions entirely. I haven't even got to the other reports. I haven't even got to the 10 report or the 2006 report that remained on somebody's desk. We're talking about what has been, unfortunately, called Mr. McGee's report. Do you understand the point I'm making?
Oh, no, I do. Okay. And the word, and I think I said it earlier in the meeting. The relationship between Mr. Culhane and Mr. Barrett is not good.
Okay. So, okay. Mr. McGee.
So I was and they both actually reported to me.
Yes.
The challenge that I had was to try and get them to actually work together so that we could. Make things happen so we could implement things. That was the challenge I had. And the view that I had was that it would not be helpful at all to start to try to figure out one versus the other.
I want to come back to Mr. McGee briefly, but no, just Mr. Dunn. I have to put it to you that you failed utterly to grasp the significance of what was happening. We have a Director of Finance writing a letter to the Commissioner asking for the Secrecy Act to be invoked in relation to a man who's raising issues. Isn't that right? And you're talking about a difference of personality between the two of them, as opposed to realising that there's a serious issue here being raised by Mr. Barrett.
But that issue was being dealt with.
Okay.
But that issue was actually being dealt with.
In what way, sir?
That was November, I think, from memory.
Your note is November, yeah.
Okay. So from the end of July, we had set up a working group which was implementing the recommendations insofar as it could back from 2008. We had actually, but just one moment. We had engaged the department to make sure that the department was aware of the issues that had been raised and what was happening. Yeah. That was the second thing that we'd done. I had briefed the audit committee. Okay, so it wasn't as if. This was being ignored.
Okay, no, I see where you're coming from. I don't entirely agree with you, but I see where you're coming from. But it wasn't being dealt with. It was mentioned at any other business under it was mentioned under any other business. Subsequently, we see the record of the minute that it's longer. And certainly I agree with the point that Deputy Kelly has made. It's in a different print. Certainly questions have to be asked. If that's the meeting, I accept it. But at the moment, there's a question around that meeting. And when you go forward to December, the actual records, we will look at this at some future date. That's what the minutes of the December Audit Committee say. So there's no sense of seriousness or urgency here, number one. We have the man, Mr. Barrett, who you all accept. Without him, this wouldn't have come to light. Totally unhappy, and somebody writing that he should be investigated under the Secrecy Act. We have Mr. McGee inadvertently coming into this with two men given two different versions. Now I'm going back to you, Mr. McGee. You produced a report in 2008. Had you any difficulty with Mr. Barrett?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Had you trust in Mr. Barrett?
Absolutely.
Okay. Had you any say in when your report wasn't acted on?
I would say, no, which in
your
terms of
2008 report, it was partially acted on, I understand, and then even
sorry, just to understand your question, Deputy. Sorry, are you go back to the 2008 period?
Yes.
Or
yeah,
okay?
No,
I wouldn't have had any. In my opinion, I wouldn't have had any input in terms of it. I mean, I did the review and sent it up.
Okay. Were you aware that there was a 2006 report?
No.
No. When was that drawn to your attention?
Just recently, I think.
Just recently?
Yeah, just recently, in terms of the 2006 internal audit report, yes.
Okay. Just, Mr. Dunn, even looking back now, and you've been asked already, do you not think it would have been better to refer the whole matter to the Controller and Auditor General, and certainly, at the very least, have notified the Audit Committee in a more substantial way?
I accept what the Controller and Auditor General's point made earlier. So I accept that view that I should have reported it on the July meeting. So the only difference here is that 6 weeks basically between one committee meeting and another committee meeting, because that's when I reported it.
I wouldn't agree with you, because when I look through your role, I think I might be unfair to you when I say you believed that it just needed to be regularised, that there was nothing improper done in the past.
I believe that there were two things that needed to be done, and there were twin tracks.
Yes.
Okay, and it is important. So the finances absolutely needed to be regularised, and in my view, they needed to be regularised within 2015. So my view was that we needed to get everything from that financial perspective cleared, regularised in 2015. That's one thread.
Were you not asking? Sorry, go ahead.
And the second thread was that we needed then, having done that, to make sure that there was a full audit done of everything that had happened. And that's why I briefed the Audit Committee to say that there was going to be a demand on internal audit during 2016 to do that audit. So I was very clear that both of those things needed to happen. Very clear.
Did you ask yourself why nothing had happened about the 2008 report?
Yes, I did.
And the 2006 report?
Yes, okay. I did. Yes, I did.
And what answers did you come up with?
I actually didn't know why. Right? I couldn't come to a conclusion on that. But what I did decide was that we needed to make sure that we didn't repeat the same mistakes again. So that what I made sure was that we got all of the information, that we got it visible. And I think this is very important, that we actually made what we were doing visible to the department, so that there was no question that this could be, quote, swept under the carpet, right? That was what I was trying to do. And I think it bears that scrutiny.
Just can I ask the Chief Superintendents, the Commissioners, the aware, back in 2009, this is my final question, is it? Yeah, thanks very much. This was back in 2009, and to me, and again, tell me if I'm wrong, but this is exactly what happened. Deputy Commissioner W. Rice, back on the 18th of September 2009, that wasn't in your time now, Mr. Yeah, he writes, with reference to the above, the Garda College report. Now, this is back in 2009, financial regulation. And he clearly says, it is important to point out that all of the named companies and committees were formed at the time when there was no money made available by the state to develop and improve the welfare and sporting facilities and so on. The only means at the time to develop and improve these facilities was through the formation of the said companies. And so he goes on to say that when the public money came and was channelled through the restaurants and a profit was made, that it was okay to use that money because the government weren't funding the facilities properly, and he saw absolutely nothing wrong with the use of that money. And therein lies the problem, in my opinion. Now, do you disagree with that? I'm particularly talking to the members of the Garda Síochána.
Do you disagree with what, Deputy?
That mentality, that public money going into the Garda Síochána to pay for guards, goes into the restaurant, a profit is made, the money is channelled into various groups for sporting facilities because, in the opinion of that commissioner, there wasn't enough money going from the government. And so if there was money left over at the end of the year, it certainly wasn't going back to the public coffers.
Well, from my reading of that piece of correspondence, it's clear to me that the Deputy Commissioner at that time believed that money was not state money. He clearly states that it wasn't state money.
He said, I believe that any surplus money does not belong to the state,
yes.
but is rather that surplus money now that was generated from
yes.
public funds.
Yes.
Okay.
So, obviously, that was his view at the time. I don't hold with that view.
You don't hold with that view?
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just being on the ground, that the view and the understanding in terms of where the money was coming from, it was believed that the money paid clearly from the Garda vote was the individual members and trainees, that it belonged to them. And it's as a result of that belief that view would have been held in the college over the years.
Yeah, at the other, what I actually wanted to come back to in relation to that view and lack of candour, right up to this year, the head of the Audit Committee is speaking to you, Deputy O'Coulon, Commissioner. I'm very bad on the titles, I beg your pardon. Gomaleshka. Níl Scrífa. Beg she wadni safe Eska Scrífa. But they're talking about lack of candour the whole way up, right up to this year. The lack of candour. Mr. Howard has it on record. And in fairness, he doesn't attribute it to you and he doesn't attribute it to the Commissioner, but he talks about the difficulty of sort of giving out about the messenger and the lack of candour right up. So that's our difficulty at the committee. Would you like to comment on that? Or no?
Can I comment, please? The Garda Training College was set up in 1964. And training moved from headquarters to Templemore. There was a financial architecture, I suppose, put in place with the full knowledge of the Department of Justice at the time. And that has evolved over the years until when the Walsh Report was implemented. And even going back as far as 1986...
Can I just interrupt you? I'm finished. Just 1 second. You can talk, but just... All of that has been said repeatedly by the Commissioner, by other... That's all been accepted. That hasn't been accepted by the various people who carried out reports, including the McGee report, the Nolan report, the internal audit, which says all of this was off-balance sheet, irregular, outside of financial control. So giving me the historical aspect again is not helpful. What we're looking at, it was completely outside of acceptable standards, not now looking back, but in 2008, in 2006, in 2010. That's the difficulty we have. And so when you keep going back to that narrative, it does not inspire confidence. It would be more inspiring for us to say, we're dealing with the lack of candour. Where is the lack of candour coming from? When Mr. Howard, as chair of the Audit Committee, says there's still a lack of candour, that's the question for you to answer. Not the historical legacy justifying something which is not justified, because the various experts have said it's outside. The Controller and Auditor General has said it. They're the questions. Sorry, Chair, thank you.
Sorry, Deputy.
Yeah, sorry.
The recommendations of the Audit Committee report are accepted and they're in the process of being implemented. And absolutely, An Garda Síochána has to comply with public sector controls and regulation and indeed governance. But I think the historical perspective is important, because this was the situation that An Garda Síochána found themselves in. Going back as far as 1986, there is evidence on file. In fact, Mr. Niall Kelly came across it when he was doing his audit, where there was an investment of £200,000 at the time, directly from the Department of Justice, in the name of the Garda College, directly in the name. And that's there. So it isn't as if An Garda Síochána were, I suppose, dreaming up these things on our own. We had oversight from our parent organisation, and there is lots of evidence of that. And Mr. Gay Harris is the person in that particular one that I'm referencing. So I'm not saying that it's right, and I'm not saying that that's the funding model that should have been put in place. And clearly now it's not. But that's the backdrop to it. And we're trying to regularise that in absolutely every way we can. And in terms of Mr. Barrett and the question whether or not anything would have happened in the absence of his bringing this issue to light, as I've said earlier on, since 2013, I was endeavouring with the Executive Director of Finance and Mr Ruan to a lesser extent, because he's the Commissioner's legal representative, so he couldn't really be involved in the Sportsfield Company business. So we've been endeavouring to unravel that. In addition to that, any surpluses, and again, this is in conjunction with the Director of Finance, Executive Director of Finance, were wound down and used for the day-to-day running of the college, so that when the new students came into Templemore in September 2014, there was no drawdown on the Garda vote. It was on a net profit basis, so that in the future, those surpluses, that situation would never again arise. So there was lots of work going on to bring the situation into, I suppose, 2017 governance standards and financial controls. I suppose the elephant in the room was the issue of the Garda College restaurant staff and whether or not they were public employees. And clearly they weren't, and at a point in the 2000s they were set about going on strike and threatening to jeopardise the new training programme and the implementation of it, because the restaurant is a key, an integral part of the Garda College. So the department at that particular time rejected that suggestion. So the process continued. So there was all this, while there were efforts being made to regularise the situation, for as long as the restaurant staff remained outside the public sector payroll, for the want of a better word, there was always going to be a scenario where there was money had to be found to pay them. And whether that was right or wrong or otherwise, that was the factual position of the situation that the Garda College found itself in.